session so far. We've had a great morning so far. We've heard from Carla, we've heard from Rashad, we have heard from Justin Greenstein, and next up we have Chris Corless, who wants to ask why your why your risk radar is still analog. Chris, are you on the line?
I am here, Lauren.
Excellent. So I will stop sharing my screen, hand over to you, and you can share yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Lauren. It's a pleasure to be a part of the strategic risk family once again, and for this day. So as Lauren said, my initial question is your risk radar analog? So let me just set this up here a second. There we go. Is it showing, Lauren?
Perfect. Off you go.
Perfect. All right. So I'll jump right in here. So I'd like to suggest that we need to think differently because our stakeholders, shareholders, suppliers, employees, and communities are demanding change. Many organizations are continuing to still get it very wrong, and our stakeholders are becoming less and less tolerant when their expectations are not met in such a spectacular manner. To meet our stakeholders' basic expectations, we at a minimum must stop these catastrophic events from happening. There's a lot of other things we should be doing in the risk space, but I think this is really focusing on those catastrophic type events. Events that not only impact our organization's desired results, but also cause serious threat to their viability. What may or may not be surprising is that frequently these risks aren't the fanciful unknown unknowns. They're familiar risks. They're risks that are routinely operational risks, or what I call preventable risks. This happens not because the organization wasn't aware that the risk was there, often that they didn't have controls that they thought were important in controlling the risk. Instead, it comes down to not being able to detect the material change in the effectiveness of the control and bring that information to the right person to take an appropriate action. Deepwater Horizon and the recent tailings dam failures are great examples of these catastrophic end of the spectrum. And I believe we're watching something similar unfold with Boeing's 737 MAX challenges, and now also in Australia, Westpac, one of the major four banks, with a very significant anti-money laundering breach that happened last week. That's resulted already in the CEO and the chairman of the board resigning. And it's not just operational risk problem, although most of today I'll focus on operational risks. Kodak was a victim of a strategic risk in this sense. It's hard to believe that an organization that invented digital photography eventually fell victim to that technology by not migrating to it over time. So today, most of what I'll say is probably more geared towards the operational risk or preventable risk spectrum, but it can be applied more broadly. When I was a lot younger, and I mean a lot younger, I was fortunate to spend a lot of time on the Great Lakes in Canada with the family on a boat. And unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember that navigating on the water at that time meant using paper charts, a compass, a depth sounder, and a whole lot of dead reckoning. It wasn't quite Christopher Columbus or Captain Cook, but compared to today, it was a lot closer to them. Eventually, when I was a kid, we were able to afford some pretty cool technology, including one of the early recreational radar sets. In those days, radar was a real challenge to use, so much so that we used it even on perfectly clear days, just so we could be certain that we weren't going to hit something inadvertently because we could actually see it, as opposed to trying to decipher what this green radar screen was telling us. And fast forward to today, a modern recreational radar system is unbelievably easy to use. It automatically syncs with your GPS and your electronic charts, overlaying the radar images and helping you understand exactly what you're looking at because it's mapping it right to the map. It even highlights potential collision around you, painting those boats or those things that you're about to hit in a very distinct color red to mark danger, and can plot you or even tell you whether you're going to or how to avoid a collision, which is fantastic. I mean, I remember back in the day, every summer, the boatyards that I grew up in were filled with boats who brought their summer vacations to an inadvertent end by hitting a submerged part of the Canadian Shield, simply because they struggled with the navigation tools. But the boatyards today, they don't have the same thing. The tools are so easy to use that the boaters are able to avoid those things that could catastrophically bring their vacation to an end. It's just one example, I think, of, and a really good one, of the difference between an analog radar and a digital radar, and how can we use this in our organizations to be better at managing those catastrophic risks. So the question is, why, when it comes to risk management, especially the catastrophic kind, do we still rely on the old school tools to help detect changes and controls and then communicate them to those who can make decisions? Does your organization rely on some sort of manual audit process that's often multiplied across different lines of defense in hopes of making it detecting whether a control is ineffective? When you have a failure, is the conversation about adding more auditing into your organization? See, I see this as kind of like trying to find a needle in the haystack, except that the haystack is the size of the 100,000-seat Melbourne cricket ground. Simply adding more auditors to try and find that needle really doesn't improve the probability materially of finding it, but it sure as heck increases the costs that you have in your business. So why are you continuing to rely on an analog risk radar? As we know, the fourth industrial revolution is transforming the world around us, and I think later in the day we'll hear a lot more about that from Warren Black. It's been amazing to watch as technology transforms just about everything about our businesses and our lives. One of my favorite examples of this is simple street navigation. And some of you may remember, before smart devices and smart maps, navigating was, quite frankly, an art. You first had to know where you were. You had to pull out this large map, unfold it, or flip to the right page, figure out where you were on the map, figure out where you wanted to go on the map, which is usually on a different page. And then you had to memorize all this information and set off on your journey, hoping that things like traffic didn't make you terribly late. Today, this is all greatly simplified, as we know, and sometimes I think we take for granted, well, at least if you're using Google Maps or a Waze user. I'm not sure about the Apple Maps yet. Our organizations are successfully harnessing digital transformations to create new opportunities and gain insights into existing business drivers. These digital transformations often help to improve the speed and accuracy of information being received, to improve that decision making and ultimately the success of the business. My observation, however, is that the bulk of these efforts is focused more on the productive side, usually trying to grow revenue or reduce costs or both. But why are we only focusing on the productivity when we could also be using this effort to think about or to help reliably and repeatedly detect changes to risks that matter and communicate that information to make better decisions as well? So I think there's two parts of the decision space, and we need to start to take advantage of those digital transformations. But make no mistake, it's a challenge that we have to overcome. Shifting from analog risk radar to a digital one isn't easy. There's a lot of complexity to think about to make it usable and, probably more importantly, scalable. My recommendation, though, is to don't let this complexity stop you from starting the journey. I have a simple 4-step guide to having a go and starting your pilot project. Step 1 is really focusing, starting on what matters most. When it comes to driving a car, from point A to point B, we all know that there's several ways that a journey can fall over. Everything from bad traffic to a flat tire to an unfortunate collision, or even bad weather, like the massive hailstones that happened in Queensland the week before last. My advice to you is, if you're going to start the digital journey, and for that matter, any kind of control monitoring journey, start with what matters. Trying to do too much is an inevitable way to fail, and I see this all the time. In the context of the driving example, maintaining a safe distance safe driving distance, and especially a safe driving distance in, say, a rainstorm, is a critical factor that can influence the likelihood of having a collision, especially at highway speeds. If you get it wrong, your trip is likely to end with a bad outcome, quite frankly, potentially catastrophic. So if we adhere to step one, our focus here is, when we're thinking about our car journey, is what are the things that could prevent us from having those catastrophic collisions. There's just too many risks to think about when it comes to everything about driving a car. So we need to focus on what matters most. And this really bears repeating. I'm going to repeat it. We need to not get carried away with doing too much, especially when you're starting your journey. Make sure that you're focusing on those risks that, if they were to happen, would have a catastrophic impact. Step two is consider the data. In the case of driving, we know that visibility, speed, vehicle weight, driver reaction all have various factors in determining what a safe distance is, and it's relatively variable. The absolute measure is monitoring the distance of the vehicle in front of you, which you can do through various means, and that measure varies depending on a lot of the previously mentioned variables. How is the data collected? Is it reliable? Are there side risks such as privacy with the data? Is your algorithm robust? These are just a few of the things that you should start thinking about as you're considering what data will help you inform and make better decisions about the control effectiveness or material changes in the risks. Step three is identify thresholds for decision making. This one's probably the most complicated, and it's really important to think about early. It's important to understand that the data and how to measure or make the measurements required to make the decisions, but it's even more important to determine the criteria for decision making ahead of time. In our case, it isn't a trivial calculation to understand what is the safe driving distance to maintain as a function of speed. Well, I mean, certainly it's not trivial for me. Elon Musk, it could be trivial for. So doing it before we drive is important to have a chance of getting the number right. It's almost impossible to make the right decision when you're in the moment. You know, when you're driving at 100 kilometers an hour, visibility is declining rapidly because it's a rain event. Maybe you're having a disagreement with your partner or your spouse, or you're trying to settle the kids in the backseat. Heck, could be even because you got a cold beer and you've had a really, really busy week at the end of your journey. At times, it's challenging to consistently make the necessary measurements at speed. In those situations, trying to maintain the necessary distance, particularly if it's manual, could be exceptionally difficult. So it's interesting that you're starting to see actual car manufacturers start to eliminate these things from our purview as drivers. Things like radar-controlled cruise control and autonomous emergency braking are doing all of those calculations for you and taking almost all of that risk out of your hands. So thinking about the threshold is incredibly important. And I think making sure that you do that in advance of being in the moment is probably the most important step. And finally, my final step, the fourth step, is to ensure that you have some sort of improvement loop to continuously refine the data sources that you're using, your algorithms, and your decision making, as it's almost impossible to get right for every situation right off the bat. This is just a part of the learning process, and an improvement loop will continuously help you improve how you reliably and repeatedly detect changes in your risk that matter and make the best decisions with that information. So these are just a few of the steps that I think you can do right now to begin your transition, but don't be fooled. To do this at scale is incredibly difficult. And to ensure that you can reliably and repeatedly detect those changes that matter most and get that information to the right person for the decision, I highly encourage you to start to make friends with the broader technology transformation people in your organizations. Leveraging the tools and the technology and the processes that they have, that they're using likely already on the productive side to improve productivity in your business, will greatly enhance the probability that you will be successful in your own transformation, using those tools to migrate your risk radar from an analog to a digital one. With that, I'll leave you with one last question. what is a simple risk, a catastrophic risk, that you can start to transform from an analog monitoring to digital monitoring right now? Just wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity, and thank you for your listening. And I'm sure we'll have a few questions, but please feel free to reach out through LinkedIn anytime. And yes, that is me. I actually do take risk in my real life. I'm not quite so risk adverse. I hang off walls and rocket down hills on a mountain bike.
Thanks so much, Chris. That was awesome. Do you know, I didn't know that about you. After knowing you all these years, I didn't know that you were so risky in your alternative life. One question, while we wait for the questions to roll in, and audience members, anyone who wants to ask one, just pop it into the Q&A box down the bottom and I'll read it out. One of my first questions was, Frashad, one of our early presenters, mentioned that not only, like you said, you need to make friends with the data people in your business, but he said something that I haven't heard before, where talked about having a data scientist on the risk team. So, you know, having your very own data person. Would you agree with that? Is that something that you think risk managers should push for in order to move towards a digital risk radar?
Yeah, I do quite a lot. I think there's the skill sets that the risk functions of the future will have are going to be a fair bit different than probably what many of them are today. And that data scientist, I think, will be a solid part, particularly in the improvement cycle, as you start to get into a more mature space. It's, in fact, it's something that we've been working on here at the firm, where we've partnered with one of the universities, and we have a young, brilliant data scientist who's helping us work through some of these problems as we speak.
Our first question coming in from the audience is, are there some low-hanging fruit in terms of data that risk managers should embrace?
Well, it's interesting. So I think there's two ways of approaching this problem, and one is a kind of a control-centric way, and the other one is maybe an overall measure of the risk per se. So I guess it really depends on your organization, but looking at the variability that you're already experiencing and understanding the events that you're having in your business, starting to get more, how should I say, more confidence in the incident records that you're keeping, and the loss history or near loss history that you have will be extremely helpful in helping you understand whether your controls are as effective as you think they are. So that's probably one that I would really start to focus on. Probably right up front, is just how good is your incident history when things don't quite go the way you planned, or in some cases, actually we had this conversation in another forum, which is sometimes you actually investigate when things go to plan because they went to plan, not because of they were managed, but because it was mostly an accident. And there's equal learning in those as well.
Another question that I asked Frashad earlier is, how do you deal with too much data? Is there such thing as too much data?
I think there is right now, in as much as that you're depending on people to interpret the data. I think there's quite potentially too much. So part of that is trying to focus on what matters. So there's two ways of kind of let's say we use the car example. There's two ways of approaching that problem. One is kind of looking at all the data that's coming out of the car, right? And so you can kind of imagine now that, particularly in a modern car, probably some of the modern electric vehicles, there's just an enormous amount of data because everything in the vehicle is monitored. In trying to sift through that data and trying to understand what it's telling you about some of the risks could be very, very challenging. It can also highlight some things that you maybe didn't think of, but one way to start is actually to approach it from the other way, which is to actually think about, well, what's the risk, and then specifically find the data sets that you want first. And then you can use that bottom-up approach to try and refine the data and your analysis once you've got the skill sets in your team and the tools available.
Another interesting question from our audience is, do you think the current risk systems can help you achieve some of the points you've made? Do you have to use in-house tech development teams?
So it's a question that I'm asking a lot of the GRC vendors at this point. Because I see the GRC system as kind of being the nervous system of risk. So there's two problems that I've outlined more or less here. One is that reliably and repeatedly detecting the change in the risk. And the second problem is then trying to communicate that as quickly as possible to the individual that needs to make a decision with that information. And the GRC system, I think, is that second part. What's a little less clear to me is how the GRC systems can plug into that. So in the past, I've used SAP GRC, and we were able to do some connecting to data sets within the broader ERP, particularly asset integrity information from our maintenance activities. But it wasn't as broad as trying to look at deeper machine data, let's say coming from a Caterpillar truck or something like that. So I think I'm constantly on the lookout, and I'd be really interested to hear from anyone on the line who's maybe seeing that, where the GRC system is able to plug into the broader enterprise suites and data sets within the organization to make that connection. But I haven't as yet to see it in a really cohesive way.
This is a question from me, sort of based off that, Chris. Is cost a challenge in this sort of, getting the budget and the money? I mean, there's only limited resources in each company, and obviously there's a fight for budget. Do you find that that's a challenge for you?
It is a challenge, but it's a short-term challenge. And I think the way we've been thinking about it is really going back to that analog effort that you're putting into your organization around detecting these risks. So if you're looking and trying to find the changes in risk that matter through simply auditing, and you're spending a lot of time at that, either through first line activity or second line or third line, or however many lines you believe in, that's real effort in the organization. And one business that I looked at recently, we calculated roughly that they were spending just at the first line roughly $10 million a year through audit effort. So, with the digital transformation, certainly setting it up and building the tools and getting the technology to support it you're obviously going to have to spend something, but I think you're going to see a payback come back quite rapidly, and that doesn't even start to contemplate the potential benefits of not experiencing a major loss. I think if you were in the Westpac business at the moment, and you could have gone back and said, hey, we could have easily detected that we weren't capturing and recording all our anti-money laundering transactions to the regulator, they'd probably pay you a significant amount of money to prevent that from happening.
Imagine they would. Another question from the audience. What's your vision, Chris, for risk management in, say, 5 to 10 years? Do you think the ideas you're talking about will be mainstream? And then another part of it is, how will this impact the profession of risk management?
So 10 years, this is a good one. So let me start with the last part first. So the profession, I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, and that I think we will be able to, it'll be a significant change to the type of competencies that we have and are requiring as part of the risk functions of the future. Will be less audit related and a lot more into understanding how the data and understanding how to look at the data and what's the data telling you. 10 years, so it's interesting, right? Like, 10 years ago, I was talking about this the other day, that 10 years ago was kind of, that was almost before Apple. It's not quite 12 years, I guess it was 2007, but, it was almost before the smartphone. And to think about that simple mapping example of the old school days to how it is today, where, my phone told me the other day that there was a speed check coming up, for crying out loud. Like, it just brings you all of this information that helps you make really important decisions. So it's really tough. I think some of it's going to depend on the computing power that we have and our ability as organizations to really sift through the data and structure it in ways that will be useful to us, either through the productivity space or the risk base. I do, my hope is that, and some organizations are actually doing this, where they're developing their own virtual assistants, if you will. But I hope there's a day where maybe you're the managing director of a large oil company or something, and you can ask your virtual assistant in the morning while you're prior to your team meeting, and you can ask it just, well, what's the status of the risk of loss of containment on the Northwest Shelf? And it'll tell you, in a way that really helps you understand whether the controls are in place or the risk has changed materially. But even better, which I think is the next evolution with this data, is if something is failing, we will know what the best solution is. And so the computer will be able to tell you, it says, well, the last time this happened, we tried action A, and that solve the problem. And you can say, well, let's try action A again, and please monitor its effectiveness, because that's probably the next thing that I think we need to do with this data is, when we implement an action to fix a problem, is it actually having the impact that we think it is or not? Because if it's not, the person who made the decision needs to know, and they need to know probably pretty quickly, depending on the nature of the risk. So I think there's an ability to store this information in a way that transcends management time, which for me, coming from a lot of extractive businesses, is very exciting, because often in the extractive industry, we tend to experience events roughly every 10 years. And it's loosely tied to the time frame with which management teams are there. So a management team comes in, they learn some lessons the hard way, they say never again until they leave. Then the next team comes in and they relearn everything again. Using data to understand what these thresholds are and helping manage these risks removes it from the specific management team's knowledge base and embeds it into the fabric of the organization. And for those risks that are really catastrophic, it's absolute must. It's an absolute must that we shouldn't have tailings dams, and we shouldn't have bloody explosions in refineries that kill people, right? Or have $2 billion, well, who knows what Westpac's going to be, but maybe $1 billion fine because you screwed up an internal process and breached a compliance issue.
Chris, thank you so much for your time and your candidness, particularly in terms of the Q&A. We really appreciate it, as always.
Great. Thank you very much.
I second Chris's thoughts. Please reach out to him on LinkedIn if you want to discuss this any further. I know from my experience, Chris is always up for a chat. So, yeah, please do that. Our next session will start on the hour. This one will be from Michael Masterson from Everedge, who is going to talk about intangible risks and a new way of framing them. So you can either stay on the line or you can join us again at around 4 p.m. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, everyone.